I'd like to start out by knowing a little bit something about my audience. So how many people here are working with a utility company? Okay, how many people are with regulators? I always have to ask that because that makes me have to be careful what I say. And how many people are from California? Okay, now how many people are from neighboring states to California? And for those who don't know, that's Arizona, Nevada, Oregon. A few more hands went up, I noticed that. Okay, how many people from the East Coast? And New Yorkers in the room? Well, thank you for coming all the way to San Diego, and welcome to San Diego. Those of you who came here expecting to have this beautiful sunny weather, you really didn't look on the internet. We don't have sun in San Diego in the months of May and June, for those who didn't know that. Our temperatures are spectacular, though. I'm going to talk a little bit about, in fact, I'm going to change my whole presentation because I heard this last group of speakers up here, and I'm going to try to address some of the things that were talked about here, and I'm going to introduce them into what's happening in California right now. For those of you who aren't from California, and think of this in terms of why am I talking about California? What does this mean for me? I can tell you that California is a microcosm, and what we are experiencing now are things you will experience in the future. And for those of you who don't think that is true, just keep an open mind. The industry is changing, and technology is changing, and the way our operations, our utilities run, and the way they operate is changing. And if you do not get ahead of some of these issues today, the problems you will face in the future will be the same ones that we are facing in California right now. Perhaps the biggest challenge in our industry at this very moment is the fact that the way we charge for the services that we provide is based upon a model that really predates the dinosaur. It has nothing to do with the way we actually provide services, but the way we bill for it is just completely different. And one of the things that is created on our system, and in California we have a residential system with a two-tier rate structure, and the intent of the two-tier rate structure was we want to encourage people to use less energy. Well, the best way to do that is create some kind of a low-level block and provide that block at a rate that's somewhat reasonable, and a second-tiered block that is at a higher price to incent people to conserve more energy. Well, the interesting thing is, when you didn't have things like distributed generation and electric vehicles, and you didn't have a host of other technologies that are coming about today, that might have made sense. But it doesn't make sense today in today's world. And I'm going to explain why in just a moment. But what it has done for us, more than anything else, it has made our system less and less efficient. This is a very simple chart. It shows what the load factor on our system has been, and this is somewhat weather normalized, so you can't say that there's been some anomalies in later years. But our system had a capacity factor, a load factor, somewhere in about a 60% range. And today we are below 50, and we're heading down to about 45%. And the primary reason for that is the rate structures that we deploy today. And rate structures are basically making the system less and less efficient. And some of the reasons we couldn't have changed rate structures in the past had to do with the fact it was very hard to understand the way customers used energy. I mean, we had a meter that basically told us once a month how much energy somebody used. But the metering systems that we deploy today are far more sophisticated. We know in real time. In fact, if you're in San Diego, you go into our website, you can sign into your My Account, and you can see exactly how much energy you used every hour, in fact, on 15-minute intervals throughout the day, and historically how much energy you've used. And that becomes an important aspect in that it creates an opportunity for a wealth of new technologies to start to come into our industry, and we'll have an opportunity to change the way we do everything. But if we don't get ahead and change the rates and the structures of the rates, there'll be no incentive for the customers to take advantage of that. And what you'll end up with is a situation like the one we are in today, where again, the capacity factor is going lower and lower. Last year, we broke 20% renewable on our system. We were about 25% renewable, 23 to 25% renewable in San Diego. And that's an amazing accomplishment when you think 10 years ago, we were less than 0.5%. So we've changed the dynamics of our system considerably. We still have a little bit of coal, and actually as of now, we are no longer in the coal business. We are out of coal completely. And we are well on a glide path to actually reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to levels that are from 20, 30 years ago. Yet, our system load is probably 3 to 4 times what it was before. So we are doing a lot of the right things, but it's having a major implication to the way we provide service into our system. The biggest problem is when I talked about the rates, we basically have a system where today the variable cost that for every kilowatt hour we reduce, we only reduce about 15% of our costs. That's because the vast majority of our costs are fixed in nature. Now, how many of you have done some work in the telecom industry? Okay. And have you been in the telecom industry for 20 years, 25 years? I worked at a company that was multi-service back in the early 80s, where we had electric, gas, water, wastewater, telephone, everything. And our company was the first company in the nation to go 100% digital. And when we went digital, we really didn't understand the implications of a telecom system that was digital and what that would mean and what that would do for us. So we did what any, I think, smart engineers would do, is we went and met with Bell Labs, back when there was a Bell Labs in New Jersey. And we went and sat with some of the brightest minds and said, we are ready for the future. What does the future look like? And it was really interesting because I was on this team, and I think it was 1982 or 83. And sitting in a group of really bright guys in white lab coats, they looked good anyway, they sat there and said, well, you'll be able to do things like call forwarding and call waiting and caller ID. Nobody had envisioned something like these smartphones that we have today. It just didn't come about. It wasn't ready yet. And I'll tell you that the same thing is probably true in our industry in the electric side. I don't think we've begun to envision what our industry has the capability to do. But when you look at this chart and you see the way our cost structure, like where our costs come from, you look at it and say, well, how can you actually get ahead of the curve and start controlling some of these costs? Well, I'm going to tell you that just simply trying to curtail energy at the wrong times of day actually force you to increase some of these costs, your distribution costs, your transmission costs, your commodity costs, because you have these peaks. Now, remember I mentioned earlier the notion that we were in a situation where our capacity factor is going down every single year. Well, it's because we're trying simply to avoid energy without understanding when and how that energy is being used. And rate structures are the primary driver for why we're simply looking at energy and nothing else. So from our standpoint, we really need to change the dynamic, the relationship we have with our customers, and start educating our customers so that they can actually be part of the equation, part of the solution. Because if customers understood that, well, wait a minute, if I had turned my air conditioner on at noontime when there was an abundance of solar power on the system, and actually used energy through that time period up until we got to our peak period. The air conditioner through our peak, and by the way, our peak is between 2 and 9 p.m. We hit our exact peak somewhere between 5 and 6 p.m., but the shoulders on either side are pretty flat. So 2 to 9 p.m. is our peak on our system. And if you're simply trying to avoid energy, no one's going to turn on the air conditioner in the middle of the day. They're going to wait till they get home from work, turn on the air conditioner, and instead of it cycling through its normal cycle because the house is already pre-cooled, we're in a situation where essentially all that's happening is the air conditioner runs full bore through the peak period, and then when the peak is over and the heat starts to dissipate in the day, the customer turns the air conditioner off. And that is one of the primary factors that's driving our capacity factor down every year. So what we, and some of the things, the proposals we've been looking at is some rate structures that actually can encourage customers to use some of their own solar to actually pre-cool their house in the middle of the day so that when it gets to the peak period, the air conditioner is running at probably at about 15 to 20% of what it would have run before, dramatically impacting this relationship that we have. But there's also a wealth of other things that can happen. We've heard a little bit about energy storage before. Energy storage is a great opportunity for the customer to, again, to be part of the equation. We heard just a few moments ago the notion of combined heat and power and these abilities for customers to self-generate. There's no incentive for them to do it, so why should they do it? Well, she's exactly right. If customers are essentially looking at this and they're looking at it from a standalone basis, the only incentives that they have today are to try to manage their way around the utility rates. Well, keep in mind these rates were based upon something that has nothing to do with our costs, and we end up in a situation where people are actually creating impacts on our system, negative impacts on our system. And I'll give you again some examples of that. Take, for example, we have, I don't care, pick anybody. Does anybody work for the education, any schools out here? Okay, any, I'll call it peaky industry in the middle of the day. Does anybody work in any industry? Does anybody work at all? Okay, there's one hand. What do you do? Oh, God. Do we have any non-consultants in the room? Yes, one hand over here. What do you do?
We make electric stuff, power control.
Okay, and I'm going to guess that your system, are you a 3-shift operation?
Depends on where it is.
All right, let's find somebody who's not a 3-shift operation. This isn't really working out for me here. Okay, anybody? All right, let's take a school. Schools, basically, they start up at 8 o'clock in the morning when all the kids are showing up in the door. They run through the middle of the day, and by 3:30, 4 o'clock, they pretty much shut down, which means they're hitting their peak right about noon to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, there's a perfect example, an opportunity to put solar on the rooftop and actually have some of the demand that the school is actually experiencing served by the solar. And as the solar dissipates and goes away, the school basically is shutting down, a perfect opportunity. But what do you do when you have a situation where the utility is charging you a fixed demand and it's a cloudy day? We still have pretty much the same demand and the solar isn't there. Well, batteries are an opportunity to actually mitigate part of that. And that battery can actually manage its way through there. But there's no incentive on the rate structure other than maybe a small piece of the demand to do that. So what a lot of customers are doing is they're looking at it from the standpoint of working with aggregators and suppliers of some of these services and saying, well, we can put a battery on the system and that could actually manage the demand for the customer. And there's excess availability in that battery. Why don't we go off and sell it to the utility? And they can use it as a demand response program. Well, the flaw in that logic is the very simple thinking that the utility actually has a benefit of what is actually happening with the way that battery is operating. Well, that's not always the case. And let me just go back to the school again. Remember I said the school is peaking at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the utility is peaking between 2 and 9 p.m. So the battery basically is creating a situation where the utility is incurring more costs in the middle of the day because the school is avoiding some of the load on the system or some of the energy on the system, but not the load on the system. And at the end, they're trying to sell the battery back and looking at it, well, you should just look at the battery for what it's providing at the end of the day. Well, in reality, the battery has increased cost in the middle of the day and gave you some savings at night. But 9 times out of 10, the savings you're getting at night has been offset by the cost that you've been incurred in the middle of the day. And this is just a little bit of a graphic of what is happening on our system today. This is a chart that shows our average residential customer. And our average residential customer peaks at 8 p.m. And by the way, for the last 20 years, our average residential customer has peaked at 8 p.m. And it peaks at 8 p.m. pretty much 365 days a year, winter and summer. Now, the height of the peak is different winter and summer, obviously, but this is a typical load profile. And so the customer is trying to do the right thing. They're trying to control their energy cost, and they're putting solar on their rooftop. By the way, how many people have solar on their rooftop? I'm going to ask a couple of, how many people have electric cars? Okay, people, this is our business. You ought to be looking at this. How many people in here are environmentalists? First off, if you're not an environmentalist, you shouldn't be in our industry. I truly believe that. We should be using energy wisely. It's not just a function of using energy, it's using it wisely. And this chart shows the perfect example of what the customer's trying to do, and they're trying to do it wisely, but they were incented to do the wrong thing. Had the same customer, or the average customer, tilted his panels 10 degrees further west, that physically moves the solar shape a little bit closer to the peak at the end of the day. Yet there was no incentive for the customer to do that. So consequently, we have a situation where the customer has been doing the wrong thing because we've incenting them to do the wrong thing, and then we in the industry get really pissed off at the customer for doing the wrong thing. We have to get ahead of it and we have to fix the rates. I wanted to show what else is happening of what happens with electric vehicles. We have a situation, again, I think we had about maybe a dozen or so people who put their hands up for electric vehicles. But what happens on our system, if you take this red chart in here, this shows the average residential customer on the system, essentially how they use demand for 2012. And then what we did was we superimposed on top of this the green line. It says, now what happens when you take that average customer and you give them an electric vehicle? And you don't give them any incentive, or they don't take advantage of incentives to charge their vehicles appropriately. What happens is they actually exacerbate the situation of the peak. Now you just give a very simple time of use signal to that customer, and what happens is they're going to consume energy in the middle of the night when it's far more abundant, and they change their profile as to how they actually impact the overall grid. How many people have heard of the duct chart? Okay, welcome to California. You're going to hear about the duct chart an awful lot while you're here. SDG&E first notified or first identified that this was a problem back in 2005 when we went on our quest towards becoming more of a renewable-based utility. And we started looking out 20 years and charting what was the future going to look like. And what we saw is in the middle of March, and by the way, I could show you this chart for any month, any day of the year. It changes a little bit, but the situation is still the same. There's a belly being created in the middle of the day for the abundance of solar on the system. And that solar, again, avoids energy, but it doesn't do anything to actually serve the capacity needs on our grid. Remember, I said that the solar, for the most part, is incented to do what they want to do, conserve energy. And what they're doing, though, is they're creating this belly of the duct, which creates interesting ramp problems for us. And that has created a situation that makes it harder and harder for us to just operate the grid. The fact that we also have to put in peaking generation to serve this peak at the end of the day. Now, we are a little bit, how many people, I got to ask this question, how many people work for Southern California Edison or PG&E? Oh God, you're going to hate me. SDG&E got ahead of the curve back in 2007, and we made a strategic decision that we weren't going to add any more baseload generation. We were going to add flexible generation. It was done specifically because we identified that there was going to be a need for flexible generation. And our peak load, by the way, for those from the outside world, we're about 4,600 megawatts, 4,700 megawatts on the system. We've lost our only nuclear asset, so that's out of the equation. Coal will be out of the equation. It's out of the equation already right now. And we have about 2,000 megawatts of base load generation in our system, natural gas and some combined heat and power, and some other renewables that are base load, biogas and biomass. And that basically creates a situation of about 2,600 megawatts of a need for something that is much more peaky in nature, flexible in nature. And what we've been seeing over the last year is as we are getting further down in the belly of this duct, we're having situations where our peakers are turned on to serve the morning load and then turned off and then turned on just for 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the day to serve this peak at the end of the day. So the use of the baseload generation is actually increasing. We're getting a higher capacity factor on that generation. But the generation needs on our system, the fossil needs on the system, are in a situation where they're just getting greater and greater, and they will get greater and greater for the rest of the state as well. And batteries are another opportunity to provide some of that flexible type resource that we need on the grid. One of the things that has happened because of this rate design structure we're in today, customers again are putting more and more distributed generation on the system, but it's created a situation where we have haves and have-nots. That the customers who aren't putting it on the system are essentially subsidizing those people who are. And the primary reason for that is we have so much fixed costs. We have transmission distribution, we have generation costs to serve the peak. That doesn't matter whether you have solar or not, you're still incurring part of that peak equation. And it has created a situation where we are having, on an annual basis, from one group of customers who have the solar to another group, a shifting of costs. And in California, by the way, we are decoupled. If our sales double, our sales cut in half, it does not affect our earnings. So this is truly a burden that's being shifted from one set of customers to another. And right now, that burden's about $67 million a year. And keep in mind, I'm only a 4,600 megawatt utility. I'm not that big. And by the end of this year, that number is going to probably break $100 million a year. And yet, if rates were designed properly, customers could still take advantage of new technologies, and we wouldn't have this intra-class situation that we're getting right now. I love this chart. Somebody asked me at one of these conferences I was at and said, well, you have an electric car and you have solar on your rooftop. Aren't you part of the problem? And I went back and I went on my account on SDG&E's website and I pulled up my data. Now, I'm also a little bit of a geek when it comes to technology. I like to do little silly things in my house and change the way energy is used in my house. Some of them are very easy. Some of them are just simply clocks. Some of them are controls that I have on my iPhone. I can turn things on and off. Some of them actually have controllers to look at what else is happening in the system. And what this shows is this is the actual peak day in 2013 for SDG&E. And the black line that's on here shows what was the load of the system on that peak day. The red line is my neighbor right next door. I love to put this on here because he has an electric car and he has solar on his rooftop, roughly the same size as mine. House is almost identical to mine and his usage is almost identical to mine. And this shows essentially he hits his peak right when the utility is peaking. And on my system, on the green chart, it shows that I'm not. And I'm not because I use energy wisely. Now, by the way, I wasn't incented to do this through rate design. But this is what, if rates are designed properly, I think we can get more and more customers to be part of the equation. Because it'll create a whole new market for new market entrants to actually come in and help customers run energy and use energy more wisely. But at the same time, this creates a significant opportunity. Now, I ran some numbers and I said if 20% of our customers were to do the same exact thing, it probably translates to about a 20% rate reduction to my customers because it reduces my peak demand exposure. And keep in mind, roughly 85% of my costs are driven by my peak demand on the system. This is a chart of something that we just installed, and I know I'm running out of time, but this is a chart we just installed. We did a project at the San Diego Zoo a couple of years ago where we installed a solar integrated system with batteries, with electric vehicle charging. And this chart it looks like there's an awful lot of mess on here, but I love the chart because it essentially shows everything that's happening in this discrete little area on the system. And it shows how batteries can help mitigate some of the problem. If you look at the line that's actually purple, the one that's high in the beginning on the left here, and I think I can actually do this on, oh, okay, I pushed the wrong button. If this line right in here is the state of charge on the battery. The line that shows at the bottom is essentially how we're basically putting charging into the battery during off-peak periods. And then the green that you see on here, well, I thought I was tech savvy. The green that's on here that's fluctuating all over is what's happening on the solar coming into the system in real time. The blue in here, and the red, by the way, is what's happening in the battery, is to respond to what's happening on that solar system. And the blue in the middle of all of that green is how the solar is basically mitigated, the disruptions in the solar because of the battery on the system. The light blue at the bottom is just electric vehicles charging off and on in the system. And then at the end of the day, the battery takes whatever energy has left off and it actually injects it back in the system to serve the system peak. So this is a fully integrated system. It's the first of a kind that we have seen. It's been operating for a couple of years now. And it's giving us a lot of insights of what can actually customers do. So to address one of the questions the last panel had, the customer, if they're given the proper price signals, can be doing this exact same thing. And if they're doing it, it means we don't necessarily have to do it, which means it reduces costs for everybody else, and it provides them a level of service that I think is really what the customers, for the most part, are looking at. And I'll close with this. This is basically the future. We're going to have an integration of renewables. We're going to have electric vehicles on the grid, scattered across the grid. We're going to have solar on rooftops. We're going to have still some large base load facilities, and we're going to have all types of loads that will be speaking to each other, that will be extracting energy from batteries, will be using some of their own distributed resources, and will be part of the equation in the future. What we really need to do, though, is incent this market entrance. With this, I'll turn it over to questions.
Start back here.
Angelabolasari with STV New York. So what are you doing different than your neighbor as far as controlling your usage and meeting or reducing your demand at the peak?
Okay, I took the chart over to my neighbor and I showed it to him and I said, you're an energy hog. And he looked at it and he kind of laughed. He goes, that's not me. And I said, no, it's you, honest, look at it. And he goes, well, that's really bizarre. And he asked me the question, he goes, well, what are you doing different? And I said, we both have a pool in our backyard. And I said, one of the things I did is I set my clock on my pool to run when the solar is running. And I put a little controller in there that says if it's shady, my pool shuts down. So it was a very simple thing I do. So that took immediately probably about 2 kilowatts off the end of the day. Another thing I did is I went out and I installed a bunch of LEDs. I went around and I followed my wife for 2 days with a little checkboard. And I looked at every light she turned on and left on. And I changed every one of those lights to an LED. And then I told her she could leave those lights on, but on some other lights, actually, I put some timers. There are some areas in the closet. My wife is notorious, and she'd kill me if you're not taping this and sending it to her, I hope. She's notorious about going into the pantry, turning on the light, and leaving the light on in the pantry. Now, by the way, my wife is, I think she's a senior senior member of the National Society of Professional Engineers and Energy Engineers, yet she is the biggest energy hog there is. The simple things I did was just put some clocks, some controllers, so that let's go back to that for just a second. You can see my demand, we both have the same amount of solar on our rooftop, yet he produces far more solar in the middle of the day because I'm consuming a lot of my solar in the middle of the day to run my normal household things. And I pre-cool my house. That's a big thing I do. I run my air conditioner. Actually, for the most part, my air conditioner runs between midnight and 6 a.m. and it cools the house. For those of you who don't think this is wise, I cool my house to 65 degrees. Then it runs at about 68 degrees till noontime, and then my air conditioner turns off and does not come on again till midnight. And what that does, very simply, is it keeps my house between 72 and 74 degrees at the peak of the day. And I live inland, where it's a heck of a lot hotter than here. And so that was one major thing that I did that was a very simple thing to do with a very simple thermostat. There's another question over here.
Just curious, with that scenario, you guys compare savings at the end of the year just to validate your theory if he's actually saving more money and more?
Actually, again, it's because of the utility bill. He and I on the utility bill are almost identical. However, the burden on the system, on the utility system, is dramatically different for myself and my neighbor. And so while I'm not incented to do the things I am doing, if rates were in place, my neighbor would do the same thing. In fact, I asked him, I said, why don't you do the same thing? He goes, well, change the rates and I'll do it. Yes?
Could you tell us a little more explicitly what kind of rate design changes would incent more wise usage?
We have some proposals that are before the commission, but I'm going to talk conceptually right now. There are some people who argue that, well, let's just put a customer charge in place. And the customer charge will force customers to pay for their use of the system. But then you can have the environmentalist on the other side of the room saying, well, customer charge does absolutely nothing to incent somebody to save energy. And they're right. So customer charges may be part of the equation, but they're not necessarily the answer to the equation. Then you get into the notion of, well, let's just simply do time of day rates. Time of day rates would say that I'll give you the biggest discount between midnight and 5, then we'll give you some like shoulder periods, and then we'll only charge you a lot during the peak period. And that will do a lot for those customers who have very simple needs on the grid, because they can change some of their behavior. In fact, I think you've probably seen some stories and articles about what happened in Ontario when they just put mandatory time of use rates. They saw an automatic drop in demand of 5%. Study done by SMUD said that if it went to mandatory time of day rates, they would see an automatic reduction in demand of about 6%. 6 to 10, I think, is what the study said. So just time of day will do it, but it doesn't incent new technologies coming in. And it might incent some of the wrong technologies coming in. So one of the projects that we're looking at is actually under our Vehicle to Grid Integration Initiative, where we have dynamic pricing, where actually when you go to plug your car in, you will see day-ahead pricing. And you'll be able to say, based upon the next day, when I want to charge during the day or during the night. You'll be able to see what the prices you paid or would be paying at home on your whatever rate structure you're on. And if you're at work, you'll be able to see what those prices would be, and you can make some decisions. It may be that if it's sunny and we have an abundance of solar, and that duct chart is sitting here, that we can dump energy into a car a hell of a lot better than paying Arizona to take our energy because there's too much of it on the system. So dynamic rates are a very big part of the opportunity. But then again, I think it's a combination of some what we call demand differentiated rates with some time of day pricing and some dynamic pricing on top of that. Now it's complicated. It sounds complicated. But with today's technologies and what you can do with your iPhone and what you can do with your droids and other things, it should be relatively easy for the customer if we make it easy for the customer. But I think also pricing plans will be of benefit to the customer, because there'll be a customer who says, I have a pool and that's all I have. Well, there's a pricing plan that will work best for them. Or if I have an electric vehicle and solar and a pool, there's a pricing plan that would be best for them.
All right, well, I think we have time for one more question back here.
So you're talking about engaging with the customer, and these rate structures are really great for them. But I've done some interviews with your IOU counterparts, and their customer adoption of TOU rates is very shockingly low, even more so for critical peak pricing. It's simply that customers don't understand the rate structures. So while you may be able to put them in place, do you have the budget to effectively communicate to them how they can really take advantage of this? Because that seems to be where SCE and PG&E have failed so far.
Now the PG&E and SCE guys are going to hate me again. When we put our smart meters in, PG&E and Edison went through the same process. We had a little bit different response from our customer base than either of the other two utilities. And I'll tell you it's because our customers are smarter than the other two utilities customers, but that would be the wrong thing to say. In reality, it has to do with customer contact, customer interaction, and customer follow-through, and also customer buy-in, customer acceptance of the changes. And I think some of that's going to have to be with options. You're absolutely right that this is not going to be an easy thing to do. I was in Arizona when is anybody from Arizona Public Service here? No, okay. I was in Arizona when Arizona Public Service was first introducing time of use rates in the early 80s. And they had terrible acceptance. Customers hated it, didn't want anything to do with it. Today, when somebody buys a house in Arizona, the first thing they ask is, what are the time of use options I have? It's going to take some time, but I think one of the things that will help with that is some tools that will basically make it easy for the customer. The customer can say, if I'm buying a new house, can you look at that house's usage and usage pattern and tell me what would be the best rate for me? And then tell me how I could take advantage of some of the other rates by changing some of the things I can do. All of these things can be done on your smartphone today or can be done on a laptop computer. They are the easy things to do. I think one of the things, how many people work for solar companies in here? Now I'm going to tell you, I think you are probably, let me say, rooftop solar people, not large-scale solar people. I have 3 or 4. This is perhaps one of the best, I think, market opportunities for you is as we look at changing the dynamics of our rates, it'll provide an opportunity because you have a first contact with customer to actually sell them other services as well. It is, if you think about this chart here, well, think about the notion of, well, I could do this and I can put in something on your rooftop that's going to save you so much money. But if you do a little bit of storage with that, and you do a little bit of controller with that, and you do a little bit of that with this, you can actually save more money. I have one solar installer, which I don't see in the room here in San Diego, who is actually starting to do that now already. When they go into a customer's house, instead of trying to sell the customer a system that's going to meet 100% of the needs, he's selling systems that probably serve about 60% of the need, but then he's showing the customer how to conserve or manage the energy for the other 40% by doing some other things in technology, and also getting prepared for when these rates are ultimately going to be changing. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for your attention. I didn't have too many people walk out. And enjoy yourself in San Diego.